Poor girl falls, asleep on a CEO's shoulder on a train, but wakes up at a ranch instead of her. It was just another exhausting morning for 23-year-old Sarah Martinez. The kind of tired that sinks deep into your bones. The kind that makes you feel like you're running on empty even before the day begins. She was on the 6:15 a.m. train from Chicago to Milwaukee, heading to her weekend job at the farmer's market. One of 3 part-time jobs she juggled just to keep a roof over her head and afford her night classes in accounting. Her worn-out canvas bag sat on her lap, holding everything she owned: a thermos of instant coffee, 2 peanut butter sandwiches, and her notebook filled with budget calculations that never seemed to add up. She hadn't slept more than a few hours, but sleep pulled at her like quicksand. Her eyelids dropped, then lifted, then finally gave in, and her head gently landed on the shoulder of the man sitting across the aisle. That man was Marcus Wellington, though no one on that train would have guessed it. To most, he was just another businessman in a sharp suit. But behind that quiet exterior was the 32-year-old CEO of one of the largest sustainable farming operations in the Midwest. He wasn't used to public trains, but he preferred them when traveling alone. Less attention, more peace. And yet, as he felt the weight of this exhausted young woman leaning into him, something stirred inside him. He remembered what it was like to be that tired, to work yourself to the bone just to survive. So instead of waking her, he stayed still, let her rest, let her find peace, even if only for an hour. But fate had other plans. The train passed the stop for Milwaukee without either of them noticing. Instead, it slowed at a small rural station near Marcus's property, Millfield, a place so tiny it barely appeared on maps. When the conductor announced the stop, Marcus looked down at Sarah, still fast asleep, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Without hesitation, he scooped her up in his arms, grabbed her bag, and carried her off the train like it was the most natural thing in the world. What happened next sounds like something out of a movie. He took her to his ranch, a sprawling 3,000-acre property nestled in the rolling hills of Illinois. Not because he had some hidden agenda or ulterior motive, but because he saw something in her, a reflection of his younger self, someone fighting tooth and nail for a better life. He placed her gently in one of the guest rooms of the beautifully restored Victorian mansion that stood at the top of the hill. He left a glass of water by the bed, stepped out quietly, and let her sleep. When Sarah finally woke up, disoriented and confused, she found herself in a room straight out of a dream. Soft yellow walls, lace curtains fluttering in the breeze, sunlight pouring through the windows. Panic set in instantly. Where was she? How did she get here? This wasn't Milwaukee. This wasn't anything like her cramped studio apartment in Chicago. The smell of fresh bread and coffee wafted up from downstairs, and a knock on the door brought a warm but cautious voice. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper. She explained everything she could. How she'd been found asleep on the train. How Marcus had brought her here to rest. But none of it made sense to Sarah. She needed to get back. She had a job waiting for her in Milwaukee. People were counting on her. She couldn't afford to miss work. Not again. But when Marcus finally came face to face with her, there was no arrogance, no coldness, just honesty, apologies, and an offer she never expected. He told her about the ranch, about the growing business, about the need for someone who understood numbers, who knew what it meant to stretch every dollar, someone like her. He offered her a full-time job, a real salary, benefits, housing, everything she'd ever dreamed of, but never thought possible. And just when it seemed like the story was turning into a miracle, the plot twisted. Weeks later, Sarah discovered something strange buried in the financial records. Payments being made to a company called Hartwell Consulting Services. No invoices, no contracts, just large regular sums of money going out month after month. And each time, they coincided with visits from a well-dressed man named Richard Hartwell, someone Marcus always met with privately. At first, she thought maybe it was just bad bookkeeping, but the more she dug, the more unsettling the pattern became. These weren't just expenses. They were secrets. Secrets that could bring down the entire ranch. And when she confronted Marcus, he didn't deny it. He admitted everything. That years ago, in desperation to save the ranch, he'd altered some documents to secure a loan. That Richard Hartwell had worked at the bank back then. That he'd kept copies. That he'd been blackmailing him for over a year now. Sarah realized the truth. She hadn't fallen asleep on a CEO's shoulder. She'd stumbled into a nightmare he'd been trying to escape for years. Now, standing in the office with the evidence spread out in front of them, she looked at Marcus and said the words that changed everything. "We can't let him keep doing this. But how do you fight a blackmailer who holds your darkest secret? How do you protect a man who gave you everything when the whole world thinks he should be punished?" That's when Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands, and what she did next shocked everyone, including Marcus himself. But that's a story for the next chapter. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, meetings, and quiet tension that hung in the air like a storm, waiting to break. Sarah dove into her new role with a determination that surprised even Marcus. She wasn't just managing numbers anymore. She was learning the rhythms of the ranch, the way the seasons dictated the work, how every decision rippled through the lives of dozens of employees and their families. But beneath the surface, something else was growing. A sense of unease. A feeling that the danger hadn't passed, only shifted. Marcus had been quieter since the confrontation with Hartwell. He still smiled, still walked the fields each morning before the sun got too hot. But there was a weight behind his eyes now. He'd spent years carrying the secret of his past alone, and though Sarah had helped him turn the tables, it didn't erase the fear that someone else might come knocking one day. And then there was the matter of the money Hartwell had stolen. $450,000 was no small sum. And while he'd returned it, the damage had already been done. The ranch had barely been keeping up with its expanding contracts, and the loss had left them vulnerable. Sarah knew this wasn't over. Not really. She started digging deeper into the ranch's financial records, following trails that led her into corners of the business Marcus had never shown her before. There were inconsistencies she couldn't ignore. Invoices that didn't match deliveries. Payments delayed without explanation. Suppliers who seemed to charge more than they should. At first, she thought it was just poor record keeping, the result of rapid growth outpacing the systems in place. But the more she looked, the clearer it became. Someone inside Wellington Ranch was working against them. It wasn't just one thing. It was everything. A pattern of small betrayals, carefully hidden, all pointing toward a single conclusion. Someone close to Marcus had been feeding information to Hartwell for years. Tom Rodriguez, Marcus's right-hand man and the ranch manager, had always struck Sarah as dependable. The kind of man who'd worked hard for what he had and earned Marcus's trust through loyalty and sweat. But lately, his behavior had changed. He avoided conversations about Hartwell, brushed off questions about certain contracts, and seemed unusually interested in which files Sarah was reviewing. When she asked Marcus about it, he dismissed her concerns. "Tom's been here longer than anyone," he said. "He's family." But Sarah wasn't so sure. One evening, after most of the staff had gone home, she stayed late in the office, going through old emails and cross-referencing them with the payment logs. That's when she found it, an email chain buried deep in the archive, sent from an account registered under a fake name. It had been used to send confidential reports about the ranch's finances to Richard Hartwell, and the timestamps matched every major payment made to him. Her hands trembled as she printed the pages. She needed to confront Marcus, but a part of her hesitated. If Tom was involved, if Marcus had known and ignored it, what did that mean for everything she'd built here? The next morning, she caught Marcus before he headed out to check on the cattle. She handed him the documents without a word. Watching his face as he read, his jaw tightened, his fingers curled around the edge of the paper. Then, slowly, he exhaled. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "Not for sure." "You suspected," Sarah replied, not unkindly. He nodded. "I thought maybe he was making extra money on the side. I never imagined he'd go this far." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of betrayal settling between them, like dust kicked up from dry ground. "We have to stop him," Sarah said finally, "before he does any more damage." Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same fire that had driven her to take down Hartwell, the same relentless will that had carried her from 3 jobs and a cramped apartment to standing beside him as an equal. Together, they devised a plan. They wouldn't accuse Tom outright. Instead, they'd let him think he was still in control, still able to operate in the shadows. But Sarah would plant false data in the financial system, enough to make it look like the ranch was struggling, that Marcus was desperate for cash. If Tom took the bait, if he sent word to someone outside the ranch, they'd have the proof they needed to expose him once and for all. It was risky, dangerous even, but they both knew. If they didn't act now, the ranch would never be safe, and so the trap was set. All they had to do now was wait and hope that Tom took the bait. The days that followed Richard Hartwell's disappearance from their lives felt almost surreal. The ranch continued to thrive, the air lighter, as if everyone who worked there could sense the invisible weight had finally lifted. Marcus moved with a new kind of confidence, not just in his business, but in himself. And Sarah, she wasn't just keeping the books anymore. She was shaping the future of Wellington Ranch. But even good news came with its own kind of pressure. With Hartwell gone and the financial drain stopped, Marcus began receiving offers he couldn't ignore. Big distributors wanting exclusive contracts, investors asking about expansion, even talk of going public. It was everything he'd dreamed of when he was working those long nights in the fields, barely surviving on beans and hope. But now, standing at the edge of something bigger than he'd ever imagined, he found himself hesitating. Sarah noticed it first during their morning meetings in the office. He'd stare out the window longer than usual, his coffee cooling untouched beside him. When she asked what was wrong, he just shook his head and said, "It's nothing," the way people always do when it's definitely something. So one evening, after a particularly tense meeting with a potential investor, Sarah followed him out to the porch, where he often went to think. She sat beside him without a word, just the sound of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle filling the space between them. "You've been quiet all day," she said finally. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I keep thinking, what if I mess this up too?" She turned to look at him, surprised. "You're worried you'll make another mistake, like with Hartwell." "I'm worried I'll lose focus," he admitted. "That I'll get greedy, that I'll forget why I started all this in the first place." Sarah leaned back in her chair, considering his words. "You know, when I was working 3 jobs, I used to dream about having just one stable paycheck. One place where I didn't have to fight so hard to survive. Now that we're here, I get it. Success doesn't stop the fear. It just changes the shape of it. Marcus gave a small smile. You always know what to say. Not always, she corrected gently. Just when it matters. They sat in silence for a while before Sarah spoke again. What if we don't go the way everyone expects us to? What if instead of chasing every offer, we build something different? He looked at her, curious. Different how? What if we focus on partnerships with smaller farms instead of buying them out? What if we create a network of sustainable growers? Not just one big operation. Her voice gained energy as she talked. We help others grow the same way your grandmother helped you. We pay it forward. Marcus stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes. That's brilliant. It's not just brilliant, she said, smiling. It's necessary. And that's exactly what they did. Over the next few months, Wellington Ranch became more than just a business. It became a movement. They partnered with local farmers, offering mentorship, shared resources, and fair contracts. They launched an apprenticeship program for young people from urban areas, giving them hands-on experience in sustainable agriculture. And they kept growing, not just in profit, but in purpose. Tom Rodriguez stayed on as ranch manager, though he never fully understood the shift in direction. You're leaving money on the table, he warned once. Marcus simply replied, maybe, but we're building something that lasts longer than any one deal. As for Sarah, she became more than just Marcus's partner in business. She became his equal, not because he gave her power, but because she'd earned it, with intelligence, courage, and the kind of resilience that only comes from knowing what it means to fight for every opportunity. 1 year later, standing together at the top of the hill overlooking the ranch, Marcus turned to her with a quiet smile. You saved this place, you know. She laughed softly. No, you did. I just gave you a push in the right direction. He shook his head. If it weren't for you, I'd still be paying off a blackmailer and living in fear. You changed everything. Sarah looked out over the land, the sun casting golden light across the fields, the barns, the greenhouses filled with life. She thought about the girl she used to be, exhausted, barely scraping by, falling asleep on a stranger's shoulder on a train. That girl would never believe the life she was living now. I guess sometimes, she said quietly. You just need someone to believe in you before you can believe in yourself. Marcus nodded. And sometimes, that person finds you when you least expect it. They stood there a little longer, side by side, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. No urgency, no fear, no shadows lurking in the corners of their minds, just peace, and the quiet certainty that whatever came next, they'd face it together. Because some lifelines aren't just given. They're built with trust, hard work, and the courage to believe in something better.